And moving on to our concluding session, we have a panel of 3 presentations on the vital topic of computer security, just like we had that question just now. It seems that we hear almost daily about a new hack of protected databases and computer systems in almost every country. A key concern globally is the protection of our personal privacy and our stored information. Our first panel presenter on digital security and privacy is Brian Scriber, Vice President at Cable Labs, who will examine malicious network and distributed denial of service, or DDoS, over the next 5 years. He will be followed by Steve Lovaas, computer security expert from Colorado State University, who will give a presentation on security, privacy, and equity, a creeping revolution. CSU computer science professor Dr. Joe Gersch, who is beloved by all of his present and former students, will conclude the panel with a presentation on security and privacy. All 3 of these presentations will run back to back and then be followed by a 10-minute Q&A session at the end.
Hello, everyone. I'm Joseph Gersch. I'm an assistant professor at the Computing Science Department here at Colorado State University, where I teach cybersecurity and networking. This is a lightning panel. We have 3 speakers today. Each will be given about 5 minutes. The topic is security and privacy. With us today, we have Brian Scriber, who is a distinguished technologist and the VP for Security Technologies at Cable Labs. We also have Steve Lovaas, who is the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer for Colorado State University, and I will be the 3rd speaker talking about privacy. Without further ado, since this is a very short thing, we each have 5 minutes only, I'm going to go to this first speaker, who is Brian, and Brian will be speaking to us today about the network concerns having to do with security. So take it away, Brian.
All right, thank you, Joe, and thanks to CSU for having us here. I wanted to take a minute and talk about, why security is important. And the reality of this is that there is an adversary. There are folks that are using networks for malicious activities, and those malicious activities are not the purpose of the networks. And when this happens, right, you've got everything from ransomware, spam, on your cell phone, you're getting robocalls. All of these are taking advantage of protocol variances or some tooling that allows an adversary to have an advantage and be able to reach you so that they can use fraudulent techniques. We call it phishing, but really, what we're talking about is crime. And it's not social engineering. It's lying to you and misrepresenting themselves and what they're doing in order to get you to act or provide credentials so that they can act on your behalf elsewhere. So these crimes and how they're being leveraged, when we look at what's happening on the network and we look at things like botnets and we look at denial of service, when we see this right now, it used to be in 2019, gamers used to be the greatest focus. It was gamers on gamers was the #1 botnet and DDoS activity. So it was, hey, I'm in a game, my buddy's down the hall, I'm gonna hire a botnet and I'm gonna take him out while it improves my ability to perform in the game. In the last year, and perhaps some of this has to do with COVID, some of it has to do with people maybe being at home and having more time, those botnet activities and these malicious crimes are increasing. Now the #1 use, according to the FBI on this, is there you have criminals doing ransomware type activities with botnets. And so this is, hey, if you want your website to continue to stay up and running, then send us some funds. And if you don't want that to happen, or you don't send us the funds, then we're going to go ahead and we're going to initiate a denial of service against you. And that's now the #1 use of botnets. The #2 use isn't gamers, it's actually criminals demonstrating their botnet capabilities and what they're able to do. And interestingly, one other category showed up in the top 10 over the last year, and that is hacktivism and ransomware associated with political messages. And I think that's interesting because we're going to see probably some additional changes in the top 10 and how this works. But the reality of this is, how is this possible, right? And a 100 megabit per second botnet attack right now on the dark web would cost about $5 for an hour for a 100 megabit per second attack. Well, if you're a small business, mid-sized business, and you're relying on your website or you're relying on your phones to be able to get revenue, that can have up to a $40,000 per hour impact. So you've got an economic disparity of $5 versus $40,000 on that particular instance. And what we're seeing with the botnets, we've got like XMRig, we've got Emotet, JSE Coin, you've got all the Mirai clones, all of these now open sourced botnet firmware that can be deployed onto very cheap hardware, holes and security problems in IoT devices. This creates the foundation for which these botnets and these attacks are taking place. And you're looking at over 150 exabits per year of malicious traffic on our networks, and that's going up. And if we don't do something about this, we're not going to have the networks that we rely on for our health, our safety, our voting, being informed. Those services are going to end up taking a back seat to malicious use. And that is why security is important for us.
Okay, well, thanks, Brian. You covered some, what I would call good news or bad news in relationship to security, DDoS, and botnets. What might be some good news? What would give us some hope over the next 5 years?
So the good news, Joe, is that for the most part, particularly gaming DDoS attacks, still typically don't use reflection and amplification techniques. That is not as true for some of the organized crime and advanced persistent threat actors out there. So we still have some protocols that have an opportunity, if you will, for us to improve them, right? So CoAP version 1 had an amplification score of 34-1. CoAP version 2 brought that down to 6.5-1. 6.5-1 is still a really high amplification. So if you're initiating a botnet attack and you use some of these protocols and bounce your attack, your ability to impact is magnified by that amplification score. And then you have these things out there like OpenVPN, which is almost 40-1, and you have almost a million vulnerable OpenVPN hosts the last time we checked at the end of 2019. So
wow.
OpenVPN is increasing. Its use during COVID has increased. So it's time to take another look. But the good news is not everybody's using those attack types yet.
Okay, well, thanks. We'll have an opportunity for you, the studio audience, to ask questions of all three of us at the end. About 10 minutes we're reserving. But let's move on to Steve Lovaas. And Steve, it's your floor for the next 5 minutes.
Thanks, Joe. At least according to the poster for FutureVisions, my topic is security, privacy, and equity. One of these things is not like the other, right? So why does equity show up in the title, looking outward to 2025? Well, simply put, privacy and security are social goods, social benefits, achieved through technology, yes, but focused on the people and the data that we're protecting. And like any other social benefit, they tend to be distributed unequally across our society. Operationally, and in the organizations, IT has struggled for years with the ability to attract new people outside of the traditional white male demographic. That's an important issue, and it continues to be a struggle. And it's about diversity, a workforce reflecting the broader community where not everyone looks, thinks, or acts the same. As we consider the full spectrum of diversity, equity, and inclusion, often called DEI, diversity is the first step. And if we're still struggling with step one, it makes sense that we'd have a hard time tackling the more advanced goals. So yes, I've been trying my best to hire diverse teams of employees and student interns, diverse in terms of gender as well as racial and cultural background. And we're making progress. In fact, my current security team is over 50% women, and the CSU cybersecurity internship has attracted a number of non-white students. But what's next? What's down the road a few years? When I consider the question of DEI through the lens of security, I believe equity is the most important issue of the three. What happens when people don't feel as though they are treated as full members of a society or of an organization? One of the outcomes is that they may place less value on the shared values of the group. They may see the benefit of protecting their own information, but they may not be as inspired to protect the whole because they don't feel that the whole is looking out for them. So if we fail to consider equity, we may be doomed to incomplete security coverage. As a security leader in charge of protecting the whole of my organization, I need to find ways to get everyone pulling in the same direction. That's a doubly important issue in areas like higher education, where we have a limited ability to demand certain kinds of behavior or to require the use of certain kinds of technology. Individuals on campus tend to have more power to choose. And so we operate more at the level of encouragement, community building, and trust. And these concepts work much better when our community members feel that they are valued, fully supported members of the community. You know, in IT, we've always used lots of metaphors: desktop, trash, room, file, folder. And we do this in security too: the worm, the virus, antivirus. In fact, many of our metaphors come from public health. So I think I can justify at least a brief detour into our current pandemic. If we look back in 5 years at the COVID-19 era, what lessons will we take away? One, I think, may be that the pandemic was a whole lot worse in some communities than others. Low-income areas that were already struggling with poor infrastructure and healthcare have been hit particularly hard. So we're realizing that some epidemiological terms, like, for instance, herd immunity, may not quite work as well at the smaller scale, the more local scale, where not everyone is an equal part of the herd. I mention this primarily because I think herd is a perfect example of how equity is sometimes something we fail to consider when we talk about complex concepts and try to communicate our values across our organization or even across our nation. Of course, we want to protect everyone equally, or at least in proportion to risk. But if we don't pay attention to the way in which our messages and our technologies are spread across the herd, we're never going to get even close to uniform coverage or full compliance. So my hope is that, looking back in 5 years, we can take that lesson from 2020 with us to better protect all of our constituents, security and privacy, with equity. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Steve. That was a very interesting blend of, I would say, sociology and technology. And combining that together brings a very interesting point of view and insight to our audience, I would hope. In terms of CSU directly, you mentioned the type of people you hire, but what type of technologies reflect that you are bringing in to protect people here at CSU?
Well, so as with publicly funded higher education, we're not alone in being extremely limited in the budgets we can deploy for security technology. So I have to rely a lot on people pulling their weight in the organization. So, you know, we attempt to keep up to speed on firewalls and VPNs and zero trust networking and all the next generation technologies. But honestly, I think with limited resources, I have to rely on everybody as my human security agents almost as much as I have to rely on the technology.
That's, again, a great blend. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, I will be the final speaker for this section. Again, we'll have opportunity for you in the audience to ask questions of all of us when we go live. But my topic for today is privacy and anonymity. And in particular, what I would like to talk about is the kind of surveillance society that's being built. We have government surveillance, there's cameras everywhere. We have surveillance capitalism. Let's track everything you're doing when you're surfing the web, because we can make a, quote, better user experience for you. If we know what you're doing, we can target our advertising specifically to you. Well, yeah, it turns out all of this data they're collecting becomes big data, which is basically just like big oil in the 80s and 90s. This is money to be made by the companies. So everyone is spying on everyone, and it's not a pretty sight. There are many reasons for concern. There are many reasons for hope. The reasons for concern come from, again, the mass surveillance. Think of Clearview AI, who has billions of photos and facial recognition technologies, and bringing in the equity issue that you just brought up, Steve. The fact that Black people get more false positives than white people do with this technology is a current concern, but I'm not going to go deeply into that. Another big reason for concern is our own government in the United States and in other countries as well. The current Attorney General has been very vocal in his battle against end-to-end privacy technologies such as the Signal messaging application, which has end-to-end encryption, and said that shouldn't be allowed, and Congress appearing to back him up. And I certainly hope that doesn't happen, because we all have need for encryption. We all have need for privacy. And this call for ending that or putting back doors into encryption technologies is a pretty scary thing for privacy advocates. Other recent examples, every one of us is actually carrying a tracking device with us as we walk around. Here's one right here. This thing can be easily triangulated from cell phone towers and from Wi-Fi things, so that, for example, you can go to a protest. Let's say you're going to a Black Lives Matters protest. Pretty much the government can figure out everyone who's there, because there's identifying information on the phone, geospatial coordinate system that can find out where you are. Yes, you were present at that. And there are actual articles out there on the web, you can find them very easily, that say how to protect yourself and what to do with your phone if you are going to a protest. So it is our right as citizens of this country to have protests, but makes you wonder, is Big Brother really watching us? And the answer is, yeah, Big Brother is watching you. So how do we protect ourselves? How do we retain our anonymity? How do we retain our privacy? It is actually in the Bill of Rights. It's the Fourth Amendment. Look it up. We have a right to privacy. And that's just the technological side, cameras and tracking technologies in browsers, tracking technologies in phones and so forth. What is worrisome is the amount of people who say, well, I haven't done anything wrong. Why should I be afraid of being surveilled? And, you know, why should privacy matter to me? They just don't care. That scares me more than anything. For those people, I would highly recommend them watch a short TED Talk by Glenn Greenwald called Why Privacy Matters. You can Google that on the web. It's about a 15-minute video. It gives a very good explanation of why privacy matters and why it should matter to you. In the meantime, I would say that there's some good news. Just yesterday in the news, it said that the California laws are getting closer to the European privacy laws, in that we have to allow websites, you can turn off the tracking, do not follow me. The technology was not there to permit that kind of thing to happen. Well, it just appeared. People have created solutions so that websites, you can turn off tracking now. And I think that's a really important development. There are privacy enhancing technologies such as homomorphic encryption, other technologies that are going to make privacy more important. But again, the scary part to me is none of these technologies do any good if you don't care and you're not protecting your own privacy, because that erodes your rights just a little bit at a time till all of a sudden, you don't know it, but we really are in a 1984 world. So I'm very strong concerns, but I do have both hopes socially, as you brought up, Steve, and technically, that solutions are coming along that will help us protect from tracking, camera recording, other technologies that invade our privacy. So I'll leave it at that. We can talk about other issues when the audience is there. Do you have any questions for me, guys?
Yeah, Joe, so you brought up a couple things, and as we look to the next 5 years, it's tough to do some of this right before an election, because I think the political environment will have bearing on what we're going to see as far as privacy in the United States. But from a global perspective and a technology perspective, when we look at both of those together, the technology to say do not track has been there for a long time. It's been handily ignored by many, right? But now we're starting to see new technologies, DNS over HTTPS, DNS over TLS. We're starting to see some people paying attention to privacy. You've got like the Social Dilemma on Netflix, being able to, dive into, what's happening in Google and in Facebook. And how do you see the combination of technology and humanity evolving in the next 4 or 5 years?
Well, I'll give you reason to be scared and reason to be hopeful. It really takes, there's 4 forces at play, really. One is technology, which can easily outstrip anything that Congress can do. Technologies will be invented that allow more and more and more spying to go on by people like Google and Amazon and others. The 4 forces, to just name them, are public opinion. What do you think should it be? Policy, the law, and technology. Those are the 4 forces at play. And what's been happening is all 4 of these forces have been acting independently. We're not talking to each other. As I said, technology can outstrip legal issues easily. The law hasn't caught up to a lot of these issues, except maybe in Europe with the GDPR privacy laws. If we can just start a dialogue between lawmakers, technology makers, public opinion, and policy, I think we can create a better environment to have people become more aware of the issues at stake, that the people who are in legislatures can be more realistic in what they can prevent or encourage. Without these kind of dialogues, things will get worse. But if we can create forums in which these 4 forces at play can come together, I think we can create a much safer world over the next 5 years. But it takes leadership to make that happen. So that's the issue as far as I see it. Okay, it's kind of weird to just give a talk, give an answer, and be the moderator at the same time, but that's it for our lightning panel. And I would like to open it up to you now to ask any of us any question you have on security, privacy, social, legal, technical aspects of that. And thanks for participating in today's FutureVisions Symposium. So it's your turn, audience.
All right, thank you so much, Joe, Brian, and Steve. We have several questions. We'll try to get as many in as we can. Let's start with this one. Looking forward, excuse me, looking forward with 5G wireless and ubiquitous wireless networking, changing the classic information technology models to impact systems from the back door. Does this become a force multiplier for attackers to wreak kinetic effects with botnets? This sounds like one for Brian.
Great. And thank you, Elizabeth. And thanks again for having us, CSU. A fun talk. I also hope that if you read the poster, you weren't coming here to find out about health insurance from me. So I'm glad we got that part resolved. With this question, it's about connectivity for the devices, and botnets are currently using IoT devices as the basis from which to launch a lot of these DDoS attacks. So, connecting more devices or changing how they're connected, the former impacts that basis probably more than the latter. So changing the mechanism by which you can reach a device doesn't change anything as much as it would if you changed, does that device have identity? Is it authenticated onto the network? Are you authorizing the types of activities that device is capable of doing on the network? And really with IoT, the answer to this, and it ties into another question that's up here, but it's not just about education, but it's about creating security and giving it away and looking to standards organizations who are helping to raise the tide for all boats and all entrepreneurial and large business IoT engagements. So the big players, but also the guy who wants to make a smart collar for his dog with a camera on it. We want to have security in all these devices, because even the weakest security is a great opportunity, because you've got compute, you've got the memory, you have an operating system, and you granted that thing credentials to your network. So any one of these small IoT devices can be leveraged for those botnets. So I think that's more important than the how we connect to the devices, but it's certainly something to be aware of, and 5G security is a big focus of ours as well.
All right, thank you. The next one this one might be for Joe. Tracking can also be used in a different way. For example, if you give your phone to someone and then you go do something bad, or they do something bad while they have your phone, the phone is only used, there's an assumption that the phone is only used by one person. This mechanism could be used to create plausible deniability. What are your thoughts on how using tracking technologies to defend yourself?
In general, it's going to take multiple data points to prove somebody was somewhere. If I give my phone to you, Elizabeth, and you go to the protest, and I'm shown somewhere else on camera at the same time, we have conflicting evidence. And so you're going to have that issue of, do you have multiple data points proving someone was there? I think it's a minor concern. I think a deeper concern related to Max's question is the thing like deep fakes. When we're doing political ads, changing faces, you've probably seen all of the complaints about aging Biden, or making fake pictures of Trump, doing videos that are so real that as many of the artifacts are taken out that it looks completely realistic, and yet it's a complete fantasy. There's a lot of things that can fake where people are, who people are, what people are. I can become you and you can become me digitally. So it's going to take, again, multiple data points to prove evidence to the contrary. So
Okay.
Quick answer to that.
Thank you. The next one we'll give to Steve. In terms of social equity, do people with higher incomes have an advantage in paying for digital security in terms of software that can protect your data compared to those who have lower incomes?
Sure, and that's only one of many advantages people attain by higher income or different placement in society. The privilege of having access to readily available commercial tools is real. I like Joe's suggestion that we need to produce security that gets provided in everything and for free. Certainly, in order to get to extend my previous metaphor, to extend security to the least members of the herd in order to protect the entire herd, we need to make some analysis of how accessible the technologies are and how affordable. And perhaps, since it's a public good, a shared good, then we need to start treating it a little bit more like a public expense as well. So that's a critical piece in that equation. Yeah, great question.
Thank you. Okay, next question from Ryland. Do you believe that pushing education for public knowledge of security would help overall better security and less abuse by huge entities? So this is for anyone who wants to jump in.
I'll kick right in. You can't push something on people. They tend to reject it. They have their belief system. They live in whatever bubble they live in. And when you try to push things on people, there's rejection typically, just a defense mechanism. I believe in creating what's called a pull. People the best salespeople never sell a product to somebody. They create a willing buyer. You create a need in somebody. Say, you really need this car. You really want to buy this car. They don't push it on you. You create a pull. So the best way to educate people is not through saying you need to do this. It's to show the obvious consequences and create a self-awareness to say, gosh, I'm a little nervous now. I'm a bit paranoid. What can I do to protect myself? That is the type of education we need. I also want to change the subject. Forgive me, Elizabeth, but I want to give a big shout out to the CSU Computer Science Department. A lot of questions came up in the earlier talks about how do we protect these factories? How do we protect the cars, the mobility, the smart cities and stuff like that? These IoT devices that were indefensible. I will admit that many of the manufacturers have built really bad devices that were not protected. But there's a lot of research going on at our university right now to hack into cars and trucks, to hack into electrical systems, to do penetration testing, to learn protection techniques on the IoT in smart cities and other things. So I'm just really proud of the fact that CSU is at the forefront of protecting these new smart cities and smart cars and smart factories. So just want to let you know things are happening, and I'll shut up now.
That's a perfectly acceptable self-brag. Thank you, Joe. All right, a couple more questions we have here. Next one. One thing we've seen in the past about privacy is that lawmakers have not put in place protections about abuse. For example, hackers requesting data about other people, GDPR has been a successful attack vector. How can technologies help fixing the law frameworks?
Well, so
yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to jump in and say that laws are always reactive. They always lag behind technology because they represent a conversation and an agreement and a negotiation about problems that crop up. It's very difficult and improbable to design laws for problems we haven't imagined yet. And it's certainly unlikely that budgets would be assigned to implementing laws for problems we haven't even imagined yet. So it's always going to be the case that the law is catching up, and that's nothing new. And certainly it is the case for privacy. Privacy legislation is finally getting some traction after decades of attacks on personal information. And one of the reasons, if you want to be a little bit cynical, is the money involved in harvesting personal information. It gets used to sell things. And more recently, it gets used to extort things from people. I think there is reason for hope. There are emerging privacy technologies that are going to make it harder for that kind of exploitation. Joe, I'll hand it over to you for what you were going to say in response to that question.
I said in my recorded talk about the need for the four forces to work together to have a dialogue. And you're right, the law does lag. But technology can also help lead the law. There are encryption technologies. You can actually do computation on hidden data now, so that you can actually see the data, which this is called confidential computing. IBM, Microsoft, and others are really big into this. So the technologies to protect people are evolving rapidly, and I teach some of these in my courses. So I do think that these are going to be really, really important. And as the law catches up, technologists, we have to take the blame and the responsibility to do the right thing. So working together, having a dialogue together, creating technologies that help protect, laws that help protect, combining this together is going to create a better future for 2025.
Yeah, and I think just to tag on to that, Joe, the dialogue is important. I think having the technologists in the room would help tremendously with some of these where the unforeseen happens. So with GDPR, which is the European Data Protection Regulation, they put that in place. They did involve technologists, but part of that Max is talking about is the abuse of that, where you can ask for, hey, tell me everything you know about me, and you claim to be somebody else, and then you get the full list of somebody else's private information through your request. Well, it's that kind of piece where I think getting technologists in the room and really thinking through with the adversary's hat on our heads, how can I use this in a disingenuous way? I think that's part of how we resolve this. So there is a responsibility as a technologist. You do need to engage, and your role goes beyond what you do in your day-to-day job. Your role extends to all of humanity and trying to make this a better world. When we talk about our future visions for the next 5 years, like that is a big part of this. And I'd encourage everybody to really engage outside the office or outside the university and work to try to make this a better place for all of us.
Okay, thank you, Brian. And thank you to all of you, Joe, Brian, and Steve. That's all the time we have for questions for this presentation, but thank you so much for the panel, and thanks to everyone who asked your questions.